Well, welcome to our concert tonight. That's a way to get things going. They're a lot more relieved now that we're finished with that piece. The trumpets especially are relieved that that was over. But anyway, so welcome. Tonight we have it's a little bit different concert because it's our 30th anniversary. There have been 5 conductors that have conducted this group since its inception. 4 of which are going to be with us tonight. Jan Warren, who was the first conductor of the bands, could not be with us tonight, but the other conductors that have been with this group over the years are with us this evening, and you're going to hear selections from them. The next piece we're going to do is a piece called Salvation is Created. It was written by Pavel Chesnikov, and Chesnikov in the late 1800s and early 1900s was one of the most famous choir composers in Russia. And he was a great composer. His works were played and sung quite extensively. And then the revolution happened in 1917, 1918, and the Communist Party took over, and Chesnikov was silenced. He actually ended up dying in poverty. And even though he wrote this piece, he never heard it performed. He wrote it after the revolution. He never heard this piece performed before. So tonight we're going to play this piece for you, and we want to dedicate this piece tonight to the memory of all those musicians who have played in this group over the past 30 years that are no longer with us today. This is Salvation is Created by Pavel Chesnikov. So y'all are in for a treat tonight because we have, like I said, the three other guest conductors tonight that are going to be with us tonight. Our first guest conductor, I think, was the second conductor of the band, and I've known Brian for a very, very long time. Been friends with Brian for many, many years. Great musician, great band director, great choir director, and just a great person all around. Would you welcome to the stage Mr. Brian Ford? The next piece on the concert is going to be conducted by the conductor that conducted the group right before I came, and when I got the group, they played really, really well. Joshua does a great job with them. So would you please welcome Dr. Josh Phillip.
Thank you. I would like to say just a few words before we begin. A few things about this piece we're about to play. American Salute is a setting of a popular Civil War era song by Morton Gould. He originally wrote it for orchestra, and subsequently Philip Lang arranged it for a concert band. This is one of the rare cases where the arrangement actually exceeds the original, in my opinion. I'm very grateful for the experience of conducting this band for several years and for the opportunity to guest conduct a piece tonight. There are few things as wonderful as making music with friends, and that's what this band and what tonight is all about. So I hope you enjoy American Salute.
let them rest a minute before we play the second half of the concert. So we'll be back in about 10 minutes. So the second conductor that this band ever had was Tom Grant. And Tom took over after Jan and conducted for 9 years. Yeah, conducted for a long time. I used to have Tom come and do my band camps every year, do my trumpets. And Tom would ask me, well, what do you want me to do with the trumpets? I said, I don't care about the band music, just teach them how to play trumpet like you do. So that's what we did for the time he was with me. So I am pleased to welcome Tom Grant. I really appreciate this opportunity again to work with Mayor Burriss. We've been together for a long time, and I really appreciate everything that I've learned from him. Just a phenomenal person and mentor. I really appreciate it. The piece we want to play for you this evening is a piece by Aaron Copland. Aaron Copland was a symphonic writer, mainly for programmatic music. As he traveled the United States and everything in America, he wrote music that depicted what he saw. The piece I'd like to play for you tonight is the same. It's Down the Country Lane. It's his image of just standing down at the beginning of a road, and he just glances up and just follows what he sees. It's just continuous relaxation. Appreciate this opportunity. I hope you enjoy Down the Country Lane. next piece is by Samuel Barber. Samuel Barber was in much the same mode as Aaron Copland. He was also a 20th century composer. Barber wrote a couple of really famous pieces. Adagio for Strings, which you probably hear a lot and you don't realize you're hearing it. And then Knoxville Summer of 1915. Which one is it, Josh? 1915 or 16? Knoxville Summer of 1915? It's one of those years, yeah. You had to be in Knoxville at the time to really enjoy it. Anyway, it won 2 Pulitzer Prizes for his works that he composed. But tonight we're going to do something a little bit different from Barber. Barber was enlisted in the Army, and so he thought, well, while I'm here, I'm just going to write a little march. Well, it's not like a march like you would normally hear, like a Sousa March or a Carl King March. It's a Samuel Barber March. As a matter of fact, he called this my little march. And so this is called Commando March by Samuel Barber. last piece is a tribute to Duke Ellington. Edward Kennedy Duke Ellington was born in Washington, D.C., and it was one of the premier conductors of the big bands in the 30s and 40s. He was a great composer. He was a great arranger, and he was predominantly played at the Cotton Club in New York City. He would, every afternoon, his wife would fix dinner. They would eat dinner. He would put on his tux, and then he would take the A train to the Cotton Club. And you're going to hear that in just a little bit. So this is Duke Ellington in concert.
Burriss.